Let's do a quick analysis of export quotas for a small country. So with an export quota, the government is going to physically limit how much of an export can leave the country. That could be based on the value, it could be based on the physical quantity, but there's something that the government will do to limit how much is being sent abroad. Now this has many aspects very similar to an export tax, where their exporters have to pay in order to get access to the international market, they have to pay a tax. But once they pay the tax, they can sell as much as they want. With an export quota, you limit how much can go out. It's like it doesn't matter what somebody wants to do. Once you meet the limit, no more leaves the country. So because you have reduced the amount that can be sold abroad, you divert some of the supply into the domestic market, so you increase the supply that's available domestically. Now notice that I'm not saying that you increase the supply. That term is we use for shifting the supply curve. It actually affects the export supply curve, but let me set that aside. But the supply, the overall domestic supply will not change. The supply curve will not change when there's a quota. Instead, there'll be a change in the quantity supplied. You move along a supply curve, not shift a supply curve. So because you've had more of this available domestically, it lowers the domestic price. And I should really emphasize that it's the domestic price that changes, because you're not changing the international price because it's a small country. Now, an aspect of this is that you're going to create what are called quota rents associated with this policy, where firms that can only sell in the domestic market, or let me turn that around, that firms that get the opportunity to sell on the international market will earn more than their next best alternative, which is to sell at home. So analyzing the quota rents, it's the analog to what we've talked about with a import quota. There are rents that are created because of the quantitative restriction, and there's an opportunity for the government either to sell the license or give the licenses away that allow for exports, which has some advantages for the government. But we'll get back to that. Okay, let's say that the original, so I've just drawn a supply and demand curve. I've got a world price equal to 100, and I've just drawn a couple of curves here where this distance is the original exports, the free trade exports. And I've just pulled some numbers out of the air saying that you've got a free trade amount of exports equal to 30 units. And then the government comes in and says, we're not going to let you send 30 units. It's going to be only 20. So what you do is you limit how much can be sold abroad. Now, the final outcome will be a price, a domestic price, such that the domestic demand plus the allowed exports are going to be equal to the domestic supply. Now, how do we draw that? Let's say we're going to have a new price, new domestic price, going to be lower than the original price. such that this is the quota. So what we have is that the amount that's demanded domestically plus the amount that's allowed to be sold internationally is going to be equal to the domestic supply. And the price will adjust downward until that is the case. Okay? So this is an important first step, that you understand the general directions of the price changes and the quantity supplied, quantity demanded, and the relationship to the exports. Now let's do an analysis of the gains and losses. Okay, so let me draw in the same set of relationships. Okay, so this is the quota that's allowed to be sold internationally. And I'm going to put some letters in here, and we're going to analyze the winners and losers from this. Now, consumers, okay, domestic price falls. And I've just said it goes down to 95, just, I don't know, to pick a number. It's just something lower. So at this price, consumers gain A. Okay, the area defined by the difference in the price over to the demand curve. Standard thing. Domestic producers, okay, they're facing a lower price. They don't like this. A, B, C, D. Okay, that's the loss of producer surplus. Now the question is about the government. The government has this piece of paper that's now valuable. So let's think about this. So a domestic firm can sell at home for $95. If they sell internationally, they can sell for $100. Anybody that gets access to the international market will earn a higher price than their next best alternative, which is to sell at home. That's the rent. Now, how much rent is that? Well, let's take a look. If it's the firms that sell internationally are going to get that much revenue. That's price times quantity. If they sell at home, these same firms can only get that blue box. So C is the quota rent. Now, if the government looks at that and says, okay, we've got these pieces of paper that allow firms to get higher profits. If they sell internationally, we can sell them. We can sell those licenses. So if the government sells the licenses in an auction, the government can gain back C. And that is really the equivalent of an export tax. It's another way of generating the revenue. Instead of taxing, you make people buy a piece of paper. Now, let's kind of go through that. If the government sells those licenses, then what you have is a net loss of B and D. Okay, this is just like with an export tax. But the government possibly doesn't sell the licenses. They could give them away for free. They could give them away to on a first come, first come basis, in which case the first people in line get to keep those rents. So in that case, those firms might gain back those rents, so partially offsetting some of the losses. But you'll notice that the net effect is the same, still B and D. It's just who gets the rent goes to a different group. Or the government could choose particularly well-connected firms to choose to allow to export. It could be based on political considerations. It could be based on domestic, other domestic concerns, foreign policy concerns, whatever. So the quota rents allow the government to potentially offset some of the losses through selective issuance of the licenses. So it could be that those licenses are free, but a corrupt bureaucrat sells them. There are all sorts of different ways that those rents can be allocated. Regardless of how they get allocated, you still have these losses of B and D. Now, there's a big difference from a political economy standpoint, if you will, from a corrupt official selling a license versus having a competitive auction. And so the deadweight loss of B and D, maybe that's not exactly the same, really, in a broader sense, depending on how people allocate the license, either in a corrupt or transparent and fair way. But in any event, this is the analysis that one would use for a small country export quota. We're going to see that there's an analog with with a large country where you're going to have international implications. But for now, all of these effects happen domestically. You have deadweight losses. You've got this transfer of benefits to different groups, and has a very similar effect to an export tax, of course, depending on how the quota rents are allocated.